Why is Israel determined to outlaw Palestinian human rights defenders and civic organizations more broadly? What is the impact of designating such organizations as terrorist entities, even if done in the absence of a shred of evidence? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program on current events, policy questions, and new ideas. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Raja Shehadeh. Raja Shehadeh is a Palestinian human rights activist and prolific author. He is a founding member of Al-Haq, the West Bank affiliate of the International Commission of Jurists, that is one of the 6 organizations currently being targeted by the Israeli government. His books include Occupier's Law, Palestinian Walks, Forays into a Vanishing Landscape, which was awarded the 2008 Orwell Prize, Where the Line is Drawn, which was a 2017 BBC Radio 4 Book of the Week, and the forthcoming We Could Have Been Friends, My Father and I. He is also the author of numerous essays in Granta, the New York Review of Books, and many other publications. Raja Shehadeh, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Thank you for hosting me. It's a pleasure to be on this post.
Thank you, Raja. I'd like to start by asking you if you could please explain the significance of Israel's designation of Al-Haq and 5 other Palestinian organizations as terrorist entities. Is it just a denunciation undertaken for propaganda purposes in order to delegitimize the work of these groups? Or is it an act that has the force of law and concrete consequences for these organizations, their staff, funders, and partners?
Well, I must say that I expected many things to happen to Al-Haq, but I never expected that, as has happened for the past 2 weeks, I have been involved in defending an allegation against Al-Haq that it's a terrorist organization. I expected everything, but not such a drastic thing as declaring that the organization is a terrorist organization. And I think there's a big significance in that, and it's very telling of where things have come to, what things have come to, that we reach this position. Let me first explain the designation of terrorist organization for all these 5 organizations is under the Israeli law, the counterterrorism law. And that's an Israeli law, and that's an Israeli designation for these organizations. Now, in order for the organizations to be proscribed organizations in the West Bank, they must be put on a list, which is according to the Defense Emergency Regulations, which is a British mandate regulation.
And this is because the West Bank is ruled separately by an Israeli military government.
Yeah. The West Bank is a separate Israeli government, although under the Oslo agreements, NGOs came under the Palestinian Authority, and therefore Al-Haq is registered under the Palestinian Authority and is monitored by the Palestinian Authority. But Israel, of course, has declared in the Oslo agreements that anything to do with security, with its own security, remains under its jurisdiction. Right. And so in order for these organizations to be proscribed, they have to be listed on that list. And this has not happened yet. Now, whether it would happen or not is now a question. But even if they don't happen, Israel can still stop funding to come to them from Israeli banks and through putting pressure on the banks in the West Bank. And so the implications can be dire for these organizations. In addition to the fact that if this designation continues, then anybody affiliated with the organizations, supporting the organizations anyway, funding the organizations, can be deemed a terrorist and be tried under the counterterrorism law.
And this would comprise not just those directly working with Al-Haq at its headquarters in Ramallah, but potentially anyone who was associated with the organization.
Absolutely, potentially anyone associated with the organization or expressing support for it can be deemed a terrorist and therefore be penalized under the counterterrorism law.
Right. And why do you think Israel took such a radical measure? And why do you think it did so at this particular time? In other words, what exactly, in your view, is the Israeli government seeking to achieve with this measure?
Well, of course, what they're seeking to achieve is to stop these organizations from continuing with their work. And in the case of Al-Haq, the work has become very successful, and Al-Haq has made inroads into things that are completely new in its agenda, such as supporting and giving evidence, providing evidence for the International Criminal Court for its case, preparation of its case against Israeli officials for war crimes. And that Israel takes very seriously and has put a lot of money and a lot of diplomatic power and abilities to try to stop the case in the International Criminal Court. And so far, with American support, it seems to be succeeding. Mm-hmm. But I think I have, from practice, I think, realized that one must not attribute too much intelligence to the Israeli way of dealing with these things. It so happens, for example, that the people involved are deem themselves to be so powerful and so immune from any accountability that they can say anything and they feel they can get away with it. And they have been getting away with a lot.
I believe recently you wrote in The Guardian, they did it because they can.
They did it because they can, and because as any fascist regime in the making, the people in power lose their head and become unaware of the world around them, and they think they are capable of getting away with anything. And that is now the case with the Israeli officials and government ministers. At the same time, it must be said that as far as the Israeli public is concerned, of course, it would go along very well with them, because over the years, the Israeli public has been taught racist things about Palestinians, and the image of the Palestinian in Israel is so bad that they can believe anything about the Palestinians. And there is a racist element to this, because if you're a racist and you don't think your enemy is capable of doing anything except as a cover for terrorism. So the claim that these organizations are a cover for terrorism goes along well in Israel, because they think that yes, the Palestinians are not really genuine human rights activists and protectors of human rights, because they can't be that, because they are terrorists in their nature. And of course, all along, Israel has been trying to do this to Al-Haq. For example, when the organization was started early on, they said it's only a cover-up for the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was then, of course, an illegal organization. And then they continued to pin other allegations on the organization.
And it's telling in this respect that you have Israeli human rights organizations that are doing broadly similar, if not identical, work, who are free of such charges.
Yeah, I must say though that, for example, when the B'Tselem was accused of treason, many Israelis rallied behind them, because they are Israelis and they realize, they don't have prejudice and racist attitudes towards the entire organization and its people and those behind it. Whereas that's not the case with the Palestinians. At the same time, it is true that so many Israelis and Israeli organizations have rallied behind Al-Haq and other organizations and are very ashamed of what their government is doing. And I've received many letters of support from many Israelis saying how ashamed they are of what their government is doing. So it's not across the board, but it is true that the education in Israel is developing a generation of racists who are so anti-Palestinian that they can believe anything about the Palestinians.
And you were mentioning that several decades ago, Al-Haq was accused of being a front organization, not for the PFLP as it is now, but more broadly for the PLO, which brings me to my next question, and that's that, this is not the first time that Al-Haq has encountered harassment by the Israeli authorities. So again, as someone who was involved with the organization from its very founding, could you perhaps recount how the authorities have previously sought to obstruct its work?
It's very interesting to do this exercise because it tells how Israel views itself and its position in the world. In the beginning, and in 1981, we were holding a meeting, general meeting, in a small office which Al-Haq had in Ramallah. And our meetings were continued until late at night. And there were many cars outside, and an Israeli Jeep came along and saw these many cars and got suspicious, came into the meeting, saw all these people assembled, and immediately thought they are planning something, a terrorist attack or something like that. So they took some of the people in the meeting and beat them up and behaved very badly and held us all until they contacted their superiors. And then we made a complaint against this affair. Now, as a result of the position of how Israelis felt at that time, they took the matter seriously and investigated. Now, of course, investigation was so terrible that it kept on going and going and going, and it was like a harassment to have this investigation. So at the end, we were pleading for them to stop the investigation because it was so much like a harassment against us to keep being called to try and identify who did it. And of course, we had no way of identifying who did it because the time had passed. And then later on, there were attempts at threatening me and putting pressure on my father about my activities and putting pressure on our law office and investigating it for tax and things like that. But then in 2002, when the re-invasion of Ramallah took place, all the organizations or many offices, official and non-official and civilian, were attacked by the army, except Al-Haq. So Al-Haq went clear of that. And the idea that Al-Haq would be attacked in the way that it is now being attacked is only indicative of the standing of Israel in the world and its feeling of total immutability and impunity and inability to be accounted by anyone, by anyone.
And there were also, I believe, over the years, many arrests of Al-Haq staff. And in one instance, in the late 1980s, during the first Intifada, Al-Haq's current executive director, Sha'wan Jabbareen, was placed under administrative detention and more or less beaten to within an inch of his life, to the extent that even members of the US Congress felt the need to inquire with the Israeli authorities about this. And then Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin saying, only enough violence was used to persuade him to accept detention. So many Al-Haq field researchers and others have ended up in prison, always without charge or trial over the years, I believe.
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, when the Ansar 3 prison, the desert prison, was opened, the first to be held up there were Al-Haq people. And I remember then visiting them in that prison. And all throughout, Al-Haq people, field workers, and as you say, the director of Al-Haq, present director, were arrested and detained and tortured and asked about their work with Al-Haq, and this was one of the major accusations against them.
And I believe another board member, co-founder of Al-Haq, Charles Shammas, that the Israelis also spent several years trying to deport him from the occupied territories.
Absolutely, that's absolutely true. Absolutely true.
And do you think that Al-Haq's affiliation with the International Commission of Jurists provided some measure of protection over the years, but that, as you say, Israel's feeling of invincibility and impunity has now let all restraints loose?
You know, we in the beginning, the main reason why we affiliated with the International Commission of Jurists was exactly to provide us with protection, and it did for a long time, and perhaps it continues to in a way. But now Israel is unconcerned with the most important and active human rights organizations internationally. So, for example, they deported Omar Shakir, who is from Human Rights Watch, and however much there was an attempt to stop that action, it wasn't successful. And then World Vision was also accused of spending money for Hamas, and they ended up withdrawing from their work in Gaza, which was very important work, of course. Yeah. And it was never proven, of course. Right. So over the years, the protection of human rights organizations and human rights in general has been eroding, because Israel is less and less concerned with human rights and with its image, because it feels it can say anything. The minute it says security and terrorism, then this works well for it, and everybody is silent, and they feel this is a way out for it. I must say that the work of the High Court of Justice in this case has not helped, because
this is the Israeli Supreme Court.
Israeli Supreme Court, because in the beginning we at Al-Haq, for example, and many organizations around the world thought that as long as there is a possibility of appeal to the Israeli High Court of Justice, then everything would be all right, because there would be somebody who would
act as a check on the authorities.
Act as a check on the authorities. But as David Kretschmer has shown in his book, what's the name of the book? Occupation of Justice, recently published by Oxford University Press. The Israeli High Court of Justice has failed and failed and failed again and again and again in stopping Israeli excessive actions in all spheres in the work on the West Bank.
Well, one could even say it's been an enabling institution for the occupation. But I'd also like to ask you, I mean, you gave an explanation of Israeli impunity, but would it also be appropriate to say that this latest designation is, in a sense, a backhanded compliment, because Al-Haq and the human rights community in general, its views and reports on Israel are beginning to be taken much more seriously than in years past? You mentioned the International Criminal Court and other cases, and that perhaps Israel also feels more threatened by the activism of these organizations and their achievements than it has previously.
It's possible to say that, yes, and I'm sure that is a factor in Israeli thinking. However, the danger of succeeding in this action is also great, because now there is an organization which is in Finland, which is a Finnish Christian missionary group called FELM, which has decided not to fund DCI, the Defense of Children International Palestine, because of the Israeli designation of that organization as a terrorist organization. And they say, although we did not receive convincing evidence, and yet we are worried about jeopardizing our work elsewhere by funding this organization. So here you have a weakness on the part of the Finnish organization, which hopefully will not be followed by others, because others might be more confident
Right. So this Finnish organization is in effect saying we don't take the allegations seriously, but they represent a threat to our global operations, and so therefore we're going to respond as if they're true.
Yeah, absolutely. In a way, the good thing also you mentioned about the possibility that Al-Haq, because of its confident achievements in documenting and fighting for human rights. The other thing could be that it could be a chance to check on the possibility of Europeans supporting the NGOs and the civil society in the occupied territories, which they've always been speaking about and saying that we will support them and we think they're very important for democracy and so on. So this is a chance to see whether they will be up to their word and give the real support by refusing to accept the Israeli designation of these organizations as terrorists.
Well, I for one won't be holding my breath, but it does bring me to my next question. You've mentioned this Finnish organization earlier. You mentioned the support you've been getting from Israeli organizations, and what so far has been your assessment of the foreign response to the Israeli designation, and what impact do you think it will have concretely? And more specifically, do you think this measure can be reversed? And what do you think would be required to achieve such a reversal?
Well, at this point, the issue is whether it will be followed by a designation of these organizations as proscribed organizations in the list of proscribed organizations according to Defense Emergency Regulations. Whether this will be done or not is going to be the question, because even if they don't reverse the decision in Israel, if they don't follow it up with this order from the military commander of the West Bank, then it will be not operative in the West Bank. Mm-hmm. And so
I believe we've lost
it would be in a way the success of the campaign
Raja, if I can interrupt you, I believe we're experiencing a technical issue. Now you're back. Can you hear me fine?
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, great. I think we missed the second half of your previous answer. You froze, unfortunately.
Yeah. So I said that if the declaration of terrorist organization is not followed by an order from the military commander of the West Bank, then it would be as a sort of retraction of the full impact and full plan of the Israelis to designate the organizations as terrorists. And this would be a sort of backing off from that path.
Yeah.
And that would be an indication of the impact of international organizations and the media and the American Jewish population in the United States, which has also been very active against such a designation, and it might reverse, in effect, reverse the order. So that is what we should be looking for now.
But it struck me that many governments, at least, I mean, other human rights organizations and activists have been much more vocal, but the general response from governments seems to be, on the one hand, we haven't really received any evidence, let alone convincing evidence, from the Israeli authorities, and we're waiting to hear from them further. But at the same time, these same governments have declined to say that this measure should either be reversed or will be opposed unless and until such evidence of the direct involvement of these organizations in armed activities is forthcoming.
Well, it's always it's always on the Palestinians to prove otherwise.
Presumption of guilt.
Presumption of guilt on the Palestinian side is always the strongest. So it is to be expected. But the fact that they are saying we have not received convincing evidence is in a way indicating that they are skeptical of the Israeli position and will not act on it. So
right. And in this context, the equivalent of a severe condemnation.
Well, yeah, because we know how Israel's standing is and how politicians in the European scene and the American scene respond when the matter involves Israel.
Right. To perhaps discuss this issue more broadly, Raja, one of the main themes of your first book, Occupier's Law, published in 1985, is the massive discrepancy between how Israel governs Israeli Jews on the one hand and rules Palestinians in the occupied territories on the other. Against this background, how did you assess the recent reports by leading Israeli and international human rights organizations designating Israel as, in the words of B'Tselem, a Jewish supremacist regime, or as Human Rights Watch called it, an apartheid state?
You know, I have, from the early days, from the late 70s and early 80s, when I was following the developments in the legal sphere of what Israel was doing in the occupied territories, of changing the laws and building the settlements and enabling the settlements and creating a dual system of government for people in the West Bank, one for the Palestinian Arabs and another for Israeli Jews. I was thinking that there's no way that this can lead to anything except apartheid. And in fact, I used to say that, but could not publish it because at that time you couldn't get away with publishing anything of this sort. But it was clear to me, and in Occupier's Law of 1985, which was published in 1985, I presented the dual system of courts and planning, land use planning, and other spheres.
It's a theme that runs throughout the book.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so for me, it has been clear from the very beginning that this is where it's leading to. And then I remember being told by somebody who was in the know and who accompanied Sharon at that time, the Minister of Agriculture, I think, in the early 80s, to South Africa. And he was presented with a report about the South African government and so on. And he said, no, I don't want to know anything about it. I want to know about the system of apartheid in South Africa. And why was that? Because he was planning the same system for the West Bank and Gaza.
It was a study visit.
It was a study visit for him, and he had no question that this is what it will lead to in the West Bank and Gaza. And yet, the disappointing thing is that when the negotiations in Oslo took place, there was no attempt by the PLO to look at the system and see how it can be violated, how they can stop it from continuing. And it was possible to do that with some changes in the agreement or some terms in the agreement that would make it such a process, if not more difficult, if not impossible, more difficult. But there was absolutely no attempt at dealing with that. And the idea was that once we come as a PLO to the occupied territories, then we can ignore and delete and revoke all the military orders and bring the situation back to where it was in '67, which is, of course, it's impossible because Israel had a plan and it had a plan of how to continue with that after the Oslo agreements and after the PA, Palestinian Authority, came into being. And this is exactly what happened.
And finally, Raja, I'd like to ask you a question about how Israel continues to apply decrees in the occupied territories that derive from British mandatory legislation, such as the 1945 Defense Emergency Regulations that you mentioned previously. Your father, who was also a lawyer, in fact, challenged the applicability of these regulations in the Israeli Supreme Court during the early years of the occupation. And I believe that this theme also features in your upcoming book, we could have been friends, my father and I.
Yes, my father was asked to, I think it was a deportation case, and the deportation was taking place in accordance with the provisions of the Defense Emergency Regulations. And in his defense, he presented an affidavit, a statement under oath, to the High Court, explaining how these Defense Emergency Regulations were in fact repealed under Jordan and replaced by its own Defense Emergency Regulations, which were different from these ones that the British had done. But of course, the High Court did not accept this. And he had, throughout his career as a lawyer, always took cases which were innovative and which were important. For example, he took the case of the blocked accounts in 1954, which was the first and only case that succeeded in unblocking the accounts of the refugees which were held in banks such as the Arab Bank and such as Barclays Bank, which were in the branches in what became Israel, and all the money there held by Israel, and these banks refusing to give back the money to the Palestinians who were destitute, saying that it is now enemy property. And he raised the case against Israel at that time and succeeded in unblocking these accounts. And
this is during the 1950s.
During the 54. And this is one of these cases that I speak about in this upcoming book. We could have been friends, my father and I. It's only one of many.
Yeah, well, we're very much looking forward to the publication of your next book. And in the meantime, we'll keep following this case of Israel's latest initiative to criminalize Palestinian human rights activism. Raja Shehadeh, I'd really like to thank you for taking the time to speak to us on connections. And just as a final note, please don't forget to join us for our next episode next Wednesday, 9th of November, where we'll be hosting Alison Glick and Nora Lester Murad. Thank you very much.
Thank you.